Good morning, everyone. I am so glad that you're here, and those of you on live stream too. I'm Sue Kohler, and I am the chair of the Third Age Committee. Originally, our group was called New Old Adventure, but a lot of people had problems with the name. Either they didn't feel like old described them or how they felt, or they weren't looking for an adventure. So the committee spent a lot of time and discussions and reflections to come up with a better name. Hopefully you will like the new one, which is Third Age. Along with the name change, we've also come up with new vision and mission statements, which are up here on the slide. They are also on the church's website if you're interested in reading them later. In a few minutes, the Reverend Dr. Timothy Hart-Andersen will talk to us about life's third age and its connection with Cuba. Next month, we will delve into defining what exactly is life's third age in today's society and what are the possibilities for us. Today's schedule, there we go. Welcome, which I'm almost done with, followed by prayer. What is life's third age? A connection to Cuba, which is Tim's presentation, will be followed by questions and answers. I'll have a few final thoughts. We'll discuss future programming, and we will have coffee and cookies outside or on Zoom for those of you on live stream. So without further ado, David, will you please join us in prayer?
Good morning, everybody. I just a chance to reflect a little bit with Tim about being back in church and remind me of scriptures from the Psalms that they talked about how lovely it is to come to God's dwelling places and urging each other to go up to the house of God. So welcome to the house of the Lord as we gather here this morning. Let us pray. We'll give you thanks, O God, for this beautiful day as we gather here in person at Westminster Hall, as well as those who will gather in the safety of our own spaces. We pray, O God, that your spirits will knit us all together as one body in Christ, seeking to learning more about you and learning more about one another and also what you call us to do. We give you thanks, O God, that we can be together. May you, O Lord, bless us this day with knowledge, with faithfulness, with kindness, with justice, as we serve the people around us. And this we pray in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Glasses are all fogged up. Tim probably doesn't need introduction to any of us here. He has been senior pastor at Westminster for over 20 years now. Almost gave you an extra decade. So, Tim.
What I need is an untangling of my apparatus. Of all the groups that would understand how difficult it is to wear a mask, glasses, a microphone, and a hearing aid, this is the group that would get it. Good, I can now hear myself. I had all this ready when I was sitting over there. The mask and a hearing aid and a microphone and glasses make life really complicated these days. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for being here today. It's wonderful to see you all. I'm especially pleased to be, I don't want to put this there, I think this is the first Third Age, the new named program, and I'm glad to be here. I've spoken several times to the New Old Adventures, and that was an enjoyable time for me. I like to be able to kind of stop what I do on a weekly sort of treadmill schedule and reflect for a little bit. I do this with WOW, generally in January, and I'm glad to do it today with you all. I am going to talk about the third age and the Cuban connection and what the linkage is there. But before I get to that, I thought, here's a bunch of Westminster members who've been faithful and loyal through these last 18 months, one way or another, and here you are live in person. I thought it might be helpful for me, just before I get to the real topic of the day, just to say a few things about Westminster, where we are currently, and maybe answer some questions if you have any questions that you feel like you want to ask of me. I just want to find out, how many of you have been worshiping with us via the live stream for the last 18 months? Look at that, almost everybody. How many of you have been accessing worship through the television, KTSP? There we go, several people. And now, how many of you have been coming back to church in person? Okay, good, yeah. I'm glad to see that. We were really pleased with the turnout on last Sunday coming together. We didn't expect the crowd we saw. At 8:30, this room was filled to our maximum capacity of 75. We actually had 76. And the sanctuary's capacity is 400. We had just under 300. And that's double what we've had in the sanctuary before. So it was a good Sunday at Westminster, both in worship and the activity between services, and certainly the activity after services. I see Rachel Shield here, who helped organize that after service event last Sunday and is really providing quite a bit of staff support for this group, the third age group. So Rachel, thank you. Are you personing the chat feature and the live stream back there? Good. Westminster has been through, as has every congregation, let's just call it a very interesting year and a half. And I mean that in a Minnesota way, interesting. It's been really hard. Let's just cut to the chase. It's been difficult for us as a congregation, as it's been difficult for you as individuals or families or neighbors or workers. It has just been flat out hard. And I begin this sort of update on where Westminster is right there. It's been really hard. It's been hard for our staff members. It's been hard for our lay leaders. It's been difficult for members of the church. But having said that, we have managed, in my view, we've managed to continue to be the church, to do what a church does. And the number one thing we do is worship. And then beyond worshiping, we educate, and we've been doing that. We reach out in the community, and we've been doing that as best we can. We care for one another, and we've been doing that as best we can. David and I can tell you stories about FaceTiming into someone's hospital room as they are breathing their last breath. I mean, that's what we were doing for months and months in the early days of the pandemic. It's a little different now. I was at a hospital last week, and they wouldn't let me in to see a person before surgery, so I went up to the hospital wall and put my hand on it. I thought where it might be close to the surgical suite, and offered a prayer. And I texted in to the one person, the family, the spouse of the church member, to say I was there praying. And so we've been innovative as a staff team, and we've learned a lot along the way, and some of which we'll carry with us, much of which really into the years ahead. Our attendance has actually grown in terms of the number of people who participate through live stream and other means. KTSP tells us we have 3,000 to 5,000 people every Sunday at 1 o'clock watching us on TV. And we actually are more modest in our projections. We think it's maybe more like a couple thousand people, but that was free all of 2020, and we started paying for it in 2021, and we think that it's probably a good thing because it reaches a lot of people who are not able to, for one reason or another, reach us through the internet. So we've expanded our ministry, expanded our reach. I think you all have heard we've had new member classes with people joining the church from all around the country. And we've managed to visit some of them on trips. I was with Beth in Colorado visiting our new member couple there, the Larry and Robin Black. at the end of August. And a couple weeks ago, a couple other members of the church driving through Colorado stopped. They had an outdoor lunch with them. So we're extending the reach of the church beyond what we think of as Westminster, the walls of this place and this corner in downtown Minneapolis, which is a wonderful thing. And that will continue, I think, as we go forward. Financially, we're doing fairly well. We ended the year strong, 2020. We were down a little bit, about 5% in our giving projection from what we had started the year, but we had actually anticipated it would be a little more damaging than that. We thought that with COVID we might be 10% down, so we did better than we projected. And right now we're about 3% off in our giving this year, so our folks, even if they can't come to church, and I know that includes all of you in this room, the generosity continues. And we are the church. Even if we are apart from one another, we are still the church. Probably the area that's right now, this fall, most concerning to us is the people who can't be vaccinated, who are the young ones among us. We had anticipated church school in person. Our teachers prepared, our staff prepared, and then about 2 weeks before coming together, we decided with the surge in Delta, we needed to back off of that. So our church school kids who are not vaccinated, these are the under the age of middle school, under the age of 12, are all back on Zoom for the church school experience. And that's been hard. That's hard for the teachers and our staff members and for the kids, frankly. They would love to be here. So I want you to have a sense of what the staff has been doing. We're pivoting. Feels like we're kind of skating through this time because we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the next week or the next day, and we've learned to be rather light on our feet. One of the things that I do when I take a church group to Cuba is I say, if you don't know any word in Spanish, here's the one word you should know. Ed could tell you, and others of you, flexibilidad. You remember that, David? Flexibilidad, flexibility. It is what we have to travel in a place like Cuba, and I could say more about that in a little bit. But we've also had to have that flexibility during these months of COVID. And our staff has just done a wonderful job. Our lay leaders, our teachers, our musicians, a wonderful job in being flexible, agile, light on our feet, and being able to pivot. It's interesting to think of the personnel changes. When we were pre-COVID, we had a church staff that looked like this. Now, here we are, we're still in the midst of COVID. We have a very different church staff. We furloughed quite a few people early on in 2020. We actually furloughed 28 people at Westminster from our staff. Most of them were very part-time, nursery workers, evening receptionists, part-time singers, etc. But it was 5.5 FTE, so the equivalent of 5.5 individuals were furloughed or put on or we even closed some positions. Most of them, in fact, all of them were related to the use of the building. We had staffed up when we opened this space to use the facility, and when we couldn't use the facility, we staffed down. And now we're in the phase of slowly building our staff team back up. But along the way, we had plans heading into 2020. We had planned a director of communication coming on staff. And a church our size should have a director of communication. We had planned a director of engagement, congregational and community engagement. And so we went ahead and hired Rachel. We had these plans to sort of build our staff in terms of reaching out. And we went ahead and did that during COVID because it wasn't related to the use of the building. We could, as Rachel has demonstrated, we could reach out very effectively through other means, through Zoom, through live stream, and social media. So we have kept our presence, our outward-facing presence, very strong, I think, during this time of COVID. And we're happy to have a new organist on our staff, Joe Chucano, a month ago. And if you come into church or listening to church, you're hearing Joe on the organ. Kenny Veen still stayed with us as a half-time position. and Amanda Weber, the lead senior musician on our staff. We now have a full team of musicians on our staff, which is wonderful. That's been a long time coming. It's 2 years since we've been waiting for this kind of threshold into a new music era at Westminster. Julie Champ, our senior administrator, left, the director of finance administration. We hired Nicole Cuno, and she started in the summer as the senior director of operations and administration. So we've been managing a lot of personnel changes through this season. Of course, Sarah Brower left as an associate pastor during this season of COVID, and Alexander Mooney came on as an associate pastor during this season of COVID. So the church has continued to do what the church does. It provides leadership in education, worship, music, congregational care. We just have done it in very different ways. I'm going to stop there. That's kind of my THA update on where things are at this point, 18 months into COVID, before I get to the Cuba comments, but I'm happy to answer questions. I have a few. It looks like Sue has one, and Marge, okay, Sue?
Is Joe full-time?
Joe Trucano, the organist, is 0.75, three-quarter time. And Kenny is half-time, Amanda's full-time. Joe Trucano is playing the organ and also managing, directing the handbells, which he had last night for the first time, and the choristers, one of the younger choirs. So again, flexibility within the staff. Amanda is not just directing the Westminster choir, but the youth choir. We're using our talent in a variety of ways. Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, could you say something about technology future of technology?
Technology?
It? Yeah.
The future of technology?
Yeah.
Well,
How are we going to use it?
it's humorous to ask me. The staff team and my kids would tell you about the future of technology. It's interesting that we've also had quite a bit of technological change at Westminster. The one that's probably most familiar to us is our live streaming and our Zooming capacity. You know, a year and a half ago, I had never Zoomed, we had never Zoomed, and now we've been zooming around like it's nobody's business. And we're actually going to other platforms. We have an internal platform called Teams. Isn't that right, David? It's like an internal Zoom technology that we're learning to use. We have Realm. How many of you have registered for Realm? Oh, look at you all. That's outstanding. Realm is, I like to think of it as our new church directory. That's the simplest way to describe. What's Realm? Well, it's the church directory, but it is a lot more than that. It's an access point to sign up for things, to check your financial support of the church, to look at calendars, to communicate within the church's systems. There's probably a third age. There is a third age group, a Realm group, so we can send an email out to Realm, through Realm to the third age group. It's a really good tool in technology for communicating, for linking ourselves to the ministries of the church. We've also added, and there he is right there, Keith Kopatz. Keith was a contract worker for us with technology before, I think about 4 years before COVID hit, coming in occasionally to help with Sunday on sound, etc. Now he's on our staff as a coordinator of AV because we need help in technology. Virtually everything we do, wow, this morning was done hybrid. David said there were 8 people in the room and 12 on the screen. So 20 people are at WOW, only 8 of them were present in person, but 20 people participated. I don't know how many of you are out there live streaming this morning, but we have about 25 in the room. We probably have that many or more live streaming. And then, of course, the live stream gets archived, so people will look at this at another time. We've discovered that some of our services are viewed more during the week than they are at the time when a class is taught or a service is offered live stream. So people are accessing, we're learning how people are accessing ministries at the church, and we're getting a lot smarter about technology. Is that kind of what you were after, Mark? Yeah, okay. And even I'm learning how to use some of this. I'm not on the Facebook yet, and I don't intend to go there. Yeah. Okay, Don?
Somehow I maybe missed the explanation on this, but what happened to Gathered at 5? I haven't heard anything about it recently.
What happened to the what?
Gathered at 5?
Gathered at 5. Okay, good question. Don's asking what happened to Gathered at 5. That was the service we held in this room on Sunday evenings at 5 o'clock. Even before COVID, we were watching the numbers very carefully, and they were diminishing, either plateauing or going down. So we might have 30 or 40 people here on a Sunday evening Gathered at 5. The other thing that we learned was that this is one of those instances where more people were accessing Gathered at 5 during the week. 4 times as many were coming to watch Gathered at 5 during the week than Sundays at 5, which said to us, maybe Sunday at 5 isn't the best time to have a service like this if they're going to access it at a time other than Sunday at 5. So we watched our attendance numbers dwindle through COVID. We had to go only live stream, and we might have 25 or 30 people on a live stream for Gathered at 5 during COVID. So the numbers were dwindling, and frankly, we had probably about 8 people involved, 8 to 10 with the technology team involved, and it just didn't seem to be a good use of resources given the engagement. So we paused the Westminster Hall service, and we created listening sessions to listen to the congregation. We had a team of lay leaders discern what should happen for worship in this space, and the result was we started up a new service in this space at 8:30 in the morning. So Sunday, did any of you come to the 8:30 service? Okay. Was it good or is it excellent? Dwayne's giving it a thumbs up. Okay, I'm getting thumbs up from, I agree. So it happens, Gathered at 5 was in this space. Now we have a worship in this space at 8:30 on Sunday morning instead of the chapel. And we reached our maximum. We were shocked. We thought 20 or 30 people would come, but we had 76, and our max was 75. So very different music. Sunday, we had a cello, a guitar, vocalist, piano. Much less formal, no robes. We debated whether we should wear ties. I wore a tie. I didn't preach from a manuscript. It was a different kind of preaching, different kind of praying. We have communion every Sunday at 8:30. It's in this space. And the reason we chose this space over the chapel is because we can live stream it. We want to give, probably a word here is portals. We want to give different portals or doorways or access to people who can't be here in different kinds of worship. So this was a 35-minute service. People live streamed it, and people were in the space. And it'll continue every Sunday at 8:30. If you have golfing or brunch or whatever, or some football game you want to watch later in the day, come at 8:30 and enjoy worship then. That answer your question, Don? Yep. Sue's got another question.
Yeah, one final question. I know we're running long here. The monthly newsletters, I miss receiving them in person. Are people really reading them online? And are they able to access them easily?
The question is, this is one of the things our director of communication helped us, again, a technology thing, going to an online-only newsletter, except we send out about, anybody know the number, something like 80 or 90 we mail every month. And if you want yours mailed to you, printed out and mailed, we will do that. A couple things about the online news. And how many of you are accessing the online news now? Good. Excellent. I was one of those who's reluctant to go this direction. I like to have a book or a newspaper in my hand, but I love it now because it comes to me directly. All I got to do is click, and there it is. I'm on my screen a lot. I like it because it's much more colorful. It's much more dynamic, and you can interact with things. You can click on links, things like that. It's I guess, a much more engaging way to know what's going on at Westminster because it's there, it's on your screen. You can move through it. You can see things in ways you can't see on our printed version. To the question of are people accessing, yes, they are accessing. You can, a new term I've learned is analytics. You can analyze how people are using the things you're putting out on the internet, and people are opening that. They particularly like to read Dear Friends from the pastor. It seems to be a popular column. You can actually see which ones, where people are navigating, how long they're staying on it. So I think it's been a success. If you have feedback on it, please let us know. If you're one of those who would like to get it in paper, let us know. We'll do that. I want to shift to the Cuba connection and Third Age. One of the times I spoke to New Old Adventures, I said to the group, and some of you may remember this, that in Cuba, they would call a group like this, La Tercera Edad. La Tercera Edad, the third age. And I had never heard that term, the phrase, except in Cuba. And I gather you're going to hear about it coming up in another program, the third age. For me, La Tercera Edad, in the Cuban view, is in contrast to La Primera Edad, the first age, which is the age of childhood, the age when someone else is kind of responsible for your well-being in your life. And then there's the second age, which is when we grow into our responsible selves and work and earn money, manage our affairs. And then the third age, and some would say, is it retirement? Well, not necessarily. And in the Cuban way, I would say the third age is that point in your life when you have attained a certain wisdom. You know, you've lived through a lot, you've been through a lot. Now maybe you get to that point in your 60s. In fact, I was just on the Zoom upstairs planning worship with two staff musicians in their 30s. And I said, I've got to go down and speak to the third age group. They're my people. Because I sense that, maybe it's during COVID, but I sense that I've moved into the third age. I'll be 69 on my next birthday. For some of you, that may sound like young. Yeah, okay. I rode my bike into church today. It's parked right back here. I was going to ride my bike into Westminster Hall to kind of demonstrate that we third agers can be physically active too. But I consider myself having moved into the third age. And it's really because I'm realizing that the kind of wisdom that comes with age that I want to impart to the generation that follows. And La Tercera Edad is, for me, a helpful way to understand where I am in my life. Of course, it begs the question, what's the fourth age? That is an age we shall all attain one day. But we're not there yet. We're in the third age, an age that sort of naturally is respected in many cultures, and that's true in Cuba. The government has programs for third agers. The church has programs for third agers. People respect their elders. Their ancianos is the word in Spanish. They're ancient ones, the ones with wisdom. We have wondered why in the world Cuba had these old men leading the government with the last name of Castro. There were lots of reasons for that. One of them is, as they aged, people didn't lose respect. In fact, they gained respect for someone who's older. And we see this in the church in Cuba. There's a generation of older Presbyterian ministers who, by virtue of their wisdom gained, their life lived, their leadership offered, their status as third age people, the rest of the church just naturally respects them. The congregation, our partner congregation, had a person who was in the pastorate there. Many of us thought it was, should have retired and left the pastorate. But the church there, the leaders there, had such respect for this older, wiser person, that the transition was up to that person, not to the church. Again, in many cultures, I think David could speak to this, certainly in Asian cultures, there's an innate respect offered to us, to those who have attained. David, you're not third ager yet, but you'll get there. Sort of an organic cultural respect. So that's where, for me, that's where I first encountered the notion of la tercera edad, the third age. And got to thinking about Cuba and its history. And I've got a history with Cuba that predates Westminster. When I was in seminary at McCormick Seminary in Chicago, we took a trip to Cuba back in 1982. And that was just 20 years plus a year or two, after what the Cubans say is the triumph of the revolution. It was, in a way, the first age of the revolution. It was an age that was characterized by a lot of revolutionary zeal and fervor, a very strong centralized control of the economy, of politics, of information, of culture, of the arts, everything, sports, managed, centralized in what became a socialist system. It was characterized by enormous amount of support from the Soviet Union. Cuba was really propped up and needed to be propped up because of our embargo on it, propped up through most of the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, in that first age of the Cuban Revolution. It entered this, what I think, the Cubans don't describe it this way, but it's helpful for me to think of it this way. It entered really what's called the second age, what I would think of as the second age of the revolution, when the Soviet Union collapsed, 1989, which was 7 years after I had been there. When I was there in 82, buildings were not crumbling, buses were running, cars were in pretty good shape. The military was very present, and lots of Europeans that were from the eastern part of Europe. When I would meet Cubans in that time and use my Spanish, they would say, "Where are you from?" And I would say, "Guess," and they would go through all the Eastern European countries. La Unión Soviética, the Soviet Union, Romania, Hungary, Hungary, all these Eastern European countries. And finally, when I would say, Los Estados Unidos, the U.S., yeah, they want to talk baseball. So that first age was an age of dynamism in Cuba. The revolution was working largely because it was propped up by the Soviet Union. The economy was strong, agricultural sector was strong, education was strong. This is when the literacy campaigns happened. Cuba has a literacy rate that's higher than our nation's literacy rate. This is when their medical system was put into place. And Cuba has an outstanding medical system, many more doctors per population than we have. I mean, by a factor of probably, I think it's one doctor for every about 160 people in Cuba, and for us it's considerably higher than that. Life expectancy in Cuba eventually exceeded our life expectancy. Infant mortality better than our infant mortality rate. So it was a strong, vibrant time in Cuba, that first age. Second age, Soviet Union collapses. The financial support overnight is withdrawn, and Cuba enters, and they call this el periodo especial, the special period, which is the decade of the 90s. And what they mean by that is it was an enormous challenge for them. There were no external support to prop them up. Our government's policies had made it very difficult for other countries or other enterprises to engage in economic development in Cuba. If another country did that, we would sanction the other country. We were very aggressive and frankly contributed to the difficulties in the third period, the second, the special period, which I'm thinking of as sort of the second age, coming to terms with what it means to be a socialist revolution without a benefactor propping you up, and with your neighbor making life really miserable for you. And then life expectancy dropped, infant mortality rose. You look at you can see now in the people born in the 90s are adults. They're shorter, they're less healthy, they're dying sooner because they did not grow up with adequate nutrition and care in the special period of the 90s. By the end of the 1990s, Cuba had shifted its economy and began allowing tourists in, and had sort of adjusted itself to the new realities of the Soviet Union finishing its business with Cuba, because Russia was not prepared to engage with Cuba the way the Soviet Union had been. So Cuba adjusted flexibility, they adjusted their economy, they began allowing tourists in, and our nation began allowing travel to Cuba, and things improved. But in the last, certainly during the Trump administration, things got a lot worse in Cuba. And I think Cuba is now, in the last year or so, entered what I would call the third age, the third phase of the revolution. No longer supported by the Soviet Union, no longer quite as isolated and I guess clinging to the socialist model of economic development. Now a third of the economy is free enterprise in Cuba, is private. A third of the economy. It was 100% of the economy was state-owned and controlled earlier. Now a third of it, which is why things are in trouble right now, because tourism has basically stopped. And most of that part of the economy was based on foreign visitors, Americans, Canadians, French, Germans, et cetera. That has come to a halt. It's really a perfect storm in the last 18 months in Cuba. With COVID, and our blockade has made it very difficult for them to survive COVID. Pharmaceuticals and medical supplies are blocked from getting into Cuba. Cubans are inventive. They've come up with their own vaccines. They are now vaccinating children down to age 2 in Cuba with their vaccines that they've developed, if they can get syringes. I could talk to Ed about that, but there's a shortage of syringes in Cuba. So they got vaccine that they've created that can't get into people's arms because of the blockade of our nation. So we're making life really miserable for Cuba right now. Cubans have brought some of this on their own self. They used to have two currencies. A currency used by foreigners was valued at 25 times the currency used by the locals. January of this year, the government merged them into one currency. So overnight, things grew in price. Salaries supposedly grew, state salaries, but with a third of the economy private, they didn't grow overnight. So suddenly you're facing enormous economic difficulty. COVID is hitting you. The blockade from the Trump administration, their policies were awful toward Cuba. So Cubans now say that they're entering another special period. Now, add to that the availability of new means of communication on the island, and it really gets complicated. We've seen in the news recently protests and people in the streets in Cuba. You never saw that before. The government controls information, controls the means of communication, but Cubans have broken out of that because of technology. Cell phones are widely available. The internet is not, but you can use a cell phone to communicate in lots of ways. Ed, how many WhatsApp messages have you received today from Cuba? 4 or 5, yeah. He and I will get 20, 30, 40 a day. We're connected to Cubans who are using WhatsApp, which is a way to communicate with your cell phone. And they're doing that on the island. So what you're seeing in the streets are Cubans communicating with one another, angry about COVID, angry about the blockade, angry about the economic situation, angry about food shortages, angry about the slow pace of reform in the economy. And it's just a perfect storm. And now they can communicate about it and go to the streets and protest. The Castros are no longer involved in Cuba. Raul Castro, the younger brother of Fidel, stepped down as the head of the Communist Party in April of this year and handed it off to a youngster, a 60-year-old named Miguel Diaz-Canel, who is very much in the sort of mold of the Castros. He's a believer in socialism, but he's also a pragmatic guy and will allow more economic reform. And he's going to have to, given what's going on the island. He's going to have to open things up. And so that's why I think we're seeing the third age of the revolution is going to be, I think, a more open economic system as the older, more revolutionary types like the Castro brothers die. The younger folks are more pragmatic. They're more connected to the internet. They're more connected. The government officials and educators and a few others could be connected to the internet. They know what's going on in the world. They know what the challenges are. Obama's initial opening to Cuba, which Raul Castro, not Fidel, but Raul collaborated on, I think Biden, I think if we can get through some of the current crises, I think we'll move more in that direction as well. But we should note that Democratic and Republican administrations alike have been awful with Cuba from the early 60s until President Obama made a change. Anyway, it's an awful time in Cuba right now, but oddly enough, I'm kind of optimistic that out of this turmoil will come some new developments that will be good. And throughout all of this, we've been connected to our Cuban friends in our partner congregation. And we've watched the generations grow and change and adapt through our partnership with the Versailles Church in Matanzas. And it's been fascinating and an important part of our outreach beyond these walls here at 12th and Nicollet. So I'm going to, I was surprised that people wanted to hear about Cuba, but I love to talk about Cuba. And now you know probably more about Cuba than you wanted to know. But I'm happy to answer more questions or say a few more things about our partnership in Cuba, which is a congregational-based partner. 20 years we've been with the same church and watched several pastors now come and go. Watched children who were 4 and 5 years old are now adults, married, having kids, and we've known them all along. And it's a wonderful partnership for us. Are there any comments or questions about what I've said about Cuba?
Several years ago, we traveled with a group from Westminster to Israel, and one of the participants there was from Cuba, a good friend of yours.
Yes.
I had a chance to ask him one time if he could look ahead 10 years, what things would he like to change and what things he would like to stay the same in Cuba. And he, at that time, said that he'd like to keep the education system the same, he'd like to keep the medical system the same, and I've forgotten the third thing. But those, it was quite interesting for me to hear that he was quite pleased. As a churchman, he was quite pleased with the way things were going.
Yeah. You're talking about Renario Arce, who is an elder in the Presbyterian Church and was the president of the seminary on the island, is a professor of theology, lives in Havana, and is a very close friend of this congregation, has preached here a couple times. And Renario's comments to you are not that out of line with what you'll hear from many Cubans. They're proud of their education system, which is free, of course. They're proud of their medical system, which is free. They wish they didn't have the blockade, which means that their equipment in their hospitals and clinics is outdated by 20, 30 or more years because they can't get the medical equipment that is available elsewhere in the world thanks to our blockade, which is one of the major foreign policy blunders of the last half century in my view. But yeah, they're proud of their medical system. It's preventative, much more so than ours. Ours is sort of reactive. Someone gets sick, you treat it with medicine. A woman who's pregnant gets much better care in Cuba than a woman who's pregnant here. Older people, la tercera edad people, get much better care, medical care in Cuba than we do here. They're more open to alternative kinds of care as well. And their education system is outstanding, and it's free. His third thing might have been something like, I don't know, maybe culture and the arts. I don't know. The Cuban art scene is really dynamic, whether it's music or visual arts or dance. It's so exciting. Or maybe he said baseball. Cuban baseball players are pretty good too. Okay, other comments or questions or corrections, Ed, to anything I've said about Cuba? Ed has been to Cuba 30 times? 28. Okay. And you may not know this about Senor Eduardo Cunnington, Mr. Ed Cunnington, but he is the leader of our denomination has a program called Living Waters for the World in various nations around the world. And there's a Living Water for the World program in Cuba. It has 62 installations where clean water is being provided in 62 different locations. Many of them are Presbyterian churches, but not all of them. And we have a person in our country who's coordinating all of that, and that's Ed Cunnington. So each of those 62 sites has a partner in the U.S. that helps maintain and support and helps install each one of those. And we've installed from Westminster 7 of them. And these. We should say a word about this. This is making an enormous difference in communities in Cuba. One of the systems in Guines, when it was installed in the Presbyterian Church there, when cholera epidemic came to Guines, where did they go for clean water? The Communist Party. Where did they tell the citizens to go? To the Presbyterian Church. They lined up to get fresh, clean water and living waters for the world. I remember one professor, Rene Castellano, told me he'd had diarrhea for 92 years until they started having fresh water. For the first time in his life, he was feeling much better. So the water system is awful. Part of the problem of our blockade is there's no resources for changing the infrastructure in Cuba. And lack of clean water is a direct result of that. Okay, anything else people want to ask about Cuba or say?
I'm watching the live stream chat. We have got a lot of our normal attendees there. And I did have a question. Is Cuba receiving any help from the Cubans in South Florida? Question from Suanne.
I didn't understand the question.
Is Cuba receiving any help from the Cubans in South Florida?
Something about the Cubans in Cuba and the Cubans in South Florida?
Yes. Is Cuba receiving any help from
No.
the Cubans in South Florida?
Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. Between my ears and our mask, it's hard. The Cubans in South Florida have an interesting, in a Minnesota way, relationship with Cubans in Cuba. The generations in the 60s that left Cuba because of the move towards socialist economics and politics ended up in South Florida. And that first generation is virulently anti-Castro and anti the Cuban system. Subsequent generations, with each subsequent generation, there's been a lessening of that. But I would say in the last probably 10 years or so, as Florida has emerged as a really important, ever since the era of the hanging chads. One of our staff members who was in her 30s used the phrase hanging chads this morning. I said, do you know what a hanging chad is? She said, well, no. So I told her about Florida and the hanging chads. Ever since that era, the one political party has worked really hard to stir up a perspective about Cuba that is, again, anti-Cuban. And they've done that with a good bit of success in South Florida. So part of the problem in Cuba right now is the remittances that families here were sending to families there were cut off in the Trump administration. So if you're a Cuban and your monthly salary is equivalent to $20 or $25, which is common, because you can receive rations from the government and you can live off that. It's hard, very hard. You're Cuban, and almost every Cuban family, except for the Afro-Cubans, white Cuban families have connections here, and they get remittances. If you're earning $25 a month and your cousin in Miami is sending you $50 a month, suddenly your income is considerably changed. This is one of the issues right now, is growing inequalities in Cuba. And the remittances were cut off into the Trump administration, which has contributed to the, we're entering a period where Cubans will be hungrier, they'll be shorter, they'll be less healthy, their birth rate will decline, mortality will increase because of our policies. And frankly, some of their own policies. I mean, it's not all on us. The Cubans themselves are, in some ways, are contributing to the problems there. Mark, you have a question?
We correctly focus on our relationships with Cuba, and you've referenced Eastern Europeans and the Soviet Union. But what's Cuba's relationship in the Caribbean with other nations, particularly Venezuela or Central America?
Yeah, good question. Cuba has played an outsized role around the world in many ways in international organizations, both ecclesiastical ones and secular ones. In the Caribbean, Venezuela moved in to kind of try to take the place of the Soviet Union, and there was a good deal of propping up of the Cuban economy by Venezuela from oil revenues. As you may know about Venezuela, that whole system, economy and political system, has been in terrible turmoil the last decade or so, which has meant that another sort of the patron of Cuba has collapsed its support. Cuba had 10,000 doctors in Venezuela in exchange for Venezuelan economic support, largely through oil. Cuba's biggest export is doctors, medical personnel. It used to be sugar, but that has collapsed. So Cuba has had military adventures around the world, in Africa particularly, liberation movements, but that's decades ago. They're not involved now militarily anywhere in the world. The player that's wanting to gain a foothold in Cuba is China. China is angling for influence in Cuba, much like the Soviet Union was back in the 60s, because it's a way to respond to American power. So Chinese are investing in oil drilling in Cuba. They're investing in transportation in Cuba. They're investing in agricultural development in Cuba as a way to build that kind of relationship. This is another reason why this is such a illogical foreign policy of ours. It's a market of 11 million people 90 miles from our shores, and we've cut ourselves off from that market. They have suffered for it, and so have we, for 60 years. Do you get the sense that I'm kind of against our government's policies toward Cuba? I don't usually say these things in sermons, but I can say them when I'm not preaching, not interpreting scripture here. Other comments or questions? Yep, Ken?
I have one, but it's not Cuban related. It relates to the first part of your talk. Could you speak to intergenerational ministries here at Westminster? I was particularly interested in your comment about passing wisdom from the third age.
Yeah.
And while it's obvious we have confirmation programs and education programs for the youth, what is the future going to look like with more intergenerational
Yeah.
ministries?
Ken's asking about the nature of intergenerational ministry at Westminster. It's a great question, and I saw it up here in your vision statement, commitment to intergenerational, I think it was intergenerational or multi-generational ministry, something like that, which is great. It's in the time of COVID, this is really hard to do. When we get beyond COVID, we'll see intergenerational connections happening on Sundays in a variety of ways, in informal ways as children and families interact with adults, in more formal ways as confirmation mentors work with confirmation students, as adults teach little kids. We don't think of Sunday school as an intergenerational event, but it is. There are 4 teachers in each classroom, and those kids interact with adults, and the adults interact with the kids. So those are intergenerational events. Our bell choir last night had 2 teenagers in it, an intergenerational bell ringing, and our staff is intentionally wanting to build up that kind of sort of cross-generational bell ringing. There's been some talk about merging high school choir singers into the Westminster choir, intergenerational there. But this is an area of, I think, a growing edge for us at Westminster, figuring out how to be intergenerational. We have a lot of families, young families and kids in our church, and connecting them to those of us who maybe are more of a grandparent's age is a key next step for us. So if you have ideas about how to do this, we have an artist in residence who's named Catherine, right?
Parent?
Yes, Catherine Parent. And she works intergenerationally. We were just talking this morning. What can she help us do intergenerationally? Creating art together, kids and adults. So there are lots of opportunities, and it's, this is where a congregation like ours can excel, as opposed to some of the congregations that tend to be niche-oriented. They're looking for young families from the age of 22 to 38, and they're not interested in older folks, the third-age folks. We have a lot of third-agers and a lot of second-agers and a lot of first-agers. And it's a much more dynamic congregation if we can connect across those ages. Okay, I think if the bells are ringing, it's noon. It's time for some refreshment, which we're going to get outside. Is that right? What's next, Sue? Thanks for inviting me to come talk.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was a fascinating and enlightening presentation. I learned a lot about Cuba. And let's see. I want to thank all of you here and those of you on live stream for coming out this morning. And I'm on the wrong page of my sheets. No, I'm not. I do want to introduce the rest of our Third Age Committee to you. If you'd stand and wave when I call your name. Andy Peterson, Bonnie Carlson in the back, Dorothy Simpson, hi Dorothy, Dwayne Lookingbill, Lucy Quaintance in the very back of the room, Terry McEwen, there he is in the back, and then we've also got Ken Jocelyn, who is not with us today, he's on a 150-mile bike ride. I don't know why, but he is. We also have Todd Munson, John Watson, and Susan Dre. We also have our hardworking staff. We couldn't do a lot of this without Rachel Shield. Hi, Rachel. And of course, the Reverend David Shin, who appears to have stepped out of the room. Future programs that we have coming up for the rest of this year. Next month, as I mentioned, what is life's third age? We will look at a more scientific approach to it. In November will be grief and the holidays. We'll hear from Reverend David Hottinger, the Hennepin County Medical Center's chaplain. December will be a fun time with Christmas carols led by Amanda Weber. She will explain the background on a number of carols, and then we will all sing. And hopefully, if there's time, you'll be able to suggest your own favorites for us to sing. Our programs are held the second Wednesday of the month, this month being an exception because we have an exceptional speaker, Tim. So the second Wednesday of the month, 11 a.m., generally in the Meisel room, but that will be on Realm, so you'll know where we will be meeting. And if you have ideas or suggestions for us for programs, we'd love to hear them. We're looking for what you want, not just what we think you want. And now, if you'll join us for coffee and conversation and cookies outside in the Courtyard Garden and on Zoom for those of you on live stream. To get to the Courtyard Garden, it's on the 12th Street side of the building. You get there by heading out the hallway here, all the way down to the tapestry, turn right towards the chapel, and then we'll have someone there at the door to direct you outside to the courtyard. But you can only get there from within the building, so don't go outside to join us. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate your coming.